Good morning, Calvary. It is really good to be here with all of you this morning. It's been a little bit, and I am excited to be here. I have been grateful for the way in which you all have kept me in the loop. I've been excited to even do simple things like read the bulletin. Oh, what's going on back at church? It's fun. I've gotten notes from some of you. That's always special. I got this big box in the mail full of food, and I happily paraded it down the halls of FB. People were looking at, ooh. Having food is a good way to boost your popularity a little bit up there. So that was great. Thank you all. I appreciate the way that you all are supporting me in my journeys up there. It's been going well, I think. It's a bit of an adjustment. The studies are intense, but I'm glad to be there, and I think God has been blessing me in my journey there. But I am glad to be back here again also, despite the excitement of a new situation and a lot of interesting people. I'm always glad to be back in the Valley. And it looks like there will probably be a few breaks sort of interspersed in my time there. And so when those breaks come, I will happily rejoin you all here like I am here this morning. Not necessarily preaching. It's not what I'm saying, but back here with you all. To start out the sermon this morning, I would like to ruin a song with you. Maybe this is a song that you know, and if it's one that you love, sorry. Not that everything about this song is terrible. In fact, there's some good stuff in it, so if you continue to like it after this, I'm totally fine with that. But I think it maybe misses a little bit of something. So, the song is Dare to Be a Daniel. And again, fine song, most of it anyway. But I want to look at some things in the song to sort of jumpstart our discussion of Daniel, which is where we'll be spending our time this morning. So, here are some of the lyrics from this song. Standing by a purpose true, heeding God's command. Sounds good so far. Honor them, the faithful few. All hail to Daniel's band. Many mighty men are lost, daring not to stand, who for God had been a host by joining Daniel's band. Many giants, great and tall, stalking through the land, headlong to the earth would fall, if met by Daniel's band. Hold the gospel banner high, on to victory grand. Satan and his hosts defy, and shout for Daniel's band. Dare to be a Daniel. Dare to stand alone. Dare to have a purpose firm. Dare to make it known. So what's so terrible about that? Sounds fine, right? Yeah, standing by a true purpose, heeding God's command. Those sound like good things, and they are. But as I mentioned earlier, I don't think this song quite captures the mood of what Daniel and his friends were actually experiencing at the time. The imagery here is all militaristic. Banners, a grand victory, toppling giants, mighty men. Daniel's band, it seems to convey the sense of like a marching song, encouraging God's soldiers to go forth and conquer. Which, okay, fine, good message, but the irony here is kind of striking because that is not what happened to God's people in the time of Daniel. They have just been defeated, taken captive, hauled away to Babylon. They're in exile. Daniel's story seems to me more one of quiet rebellion, the undermining of a seemingly successful conquest of God's people by Babylon. It doesn't mean that they're rolling over and giving up, but maybe the way that they pushed back against evil was different than what this song kind of gives the impression of. So there is a contest here, to be sure, but it's more a contest of ideologies than it is a contest of power. In fact, God's people here seem kind of weak, in power at least. But not everything is as it seems. Chapter 1 of Daniel, which is our text for today, outlines 4 separate contests between God's people and the pagan culture in which they find themselves, which in this case is Babylon. Despite being in exile, how will God's people fare in the struggle? So we're going to look at each of these 4 contests, and we're going to try to get a sense of how Daniel and his friends resisted and what the outcomes were and what that meant for them in their position in exile. So if you will, please turn with me to Daniel 1. And if you are able, would you please stand for the reading of the text? In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, the chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food, or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned you your food and your drink. For why should he see that you are in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the 1st year of King Cyrus. This is God's word. Shall we pray? Dear Father, I thank you for this morning, this opportunity that we have to gather together, to read your word, to worship together. I pray that you will bring a message to mind, bring us things that we can do to shape the way that we follow you, to shape who we think you are, and to shape our goals for praising you and for obedience to you. Thank you for the example of Daniel, and I pray that we can learn something from the way that he interacted with his position in exile. I pray this in your name. Amen. You may be seated. All right, I said we were going to look at the four different contests that are laid out here. So the first contest between God's people and Babylon is a contest of military might. Military might. And I would say it's pretty clear who wins this one. Verses 1 to 2 pretty clearly lay out the results of the battle, God's people lose. They lose the battle. Now, this is not a result of a lack of faithfulness on God's part. Rather, it's the promised punishment of God's people for their lack of faithfulness. Unfortunately, the children of Israel have disobeyed. They have rebelled against God time and time again. They have turned to idol worship and pagan practices. They have allowed themselves to be influenced by the very nations they were supposed to be a light to. And as a result, God allowed the Babylonians to conquer them and take them captive to Babylon. That's a punishment that he had promised, and it is in fact what happened. So as we're introduced to the main characters in this story, we meet them in a setting of pain and uncertainty, not victory and celebration. Daniel and his 3 friends are not a conquering band, but rather a dejected group of captives in a foreign land, surrounded by strange languages, strange customs, strange food, strange people, and a huge collection of other unknowns. They have watched their army fail, their king be defeated and humiliated, their city be ransacked, and their future be shattered by their removal to a foreign city. And this first contest, lost to the Babylonians, is only the start of the tests that God's people will endure. Thankfully, not all of Israel has forsaken the Lord, despite the widespread disobedience. It becomes fairly clear that Daniel and his 3 friends, who are true representatives of the people of God, are willing to sacrifice much to remain faithful. And because of this, God is able to use and bless them mightily in the next contests. In the face of military defeat, God gives his people other ways to resist the influences of the culture around them. So contest 1, military might. They lose pretty badly. Contest number 2, cultural identity. Cultural identity was a huge concern for the Babylonians in asserting their dominance over the kingdoms that they conquered. In order to create a cohesive empire that wouldn't fracture, the Babylonians resettled conquered nations, taking a page out of the book of the Assyrians. This included Judah and into other portions of the empire. They were trying to assimilate the conquered peoples into a broader, more cohesive Babylonian identity. Nowhere is this displayed more succinctly than in the re-education program outlined in verses 3 to 7. So here's the scene. These captives, these nobles of Judah, including Daniel and his friends, were admitted into intense training designed specifically to alter their cultural identity and bring them into a place of contribution toward this new approved set of goals. In modern terms, we might refer to this organization as the Bureau of Babylonian Brainwashing, or BBB for short. The program included education in Babylonian literature and language. It introduced them to a Babylonian diet, and it even changed their names in a clear attempt to separate them from their previous loyalties and identities. Just listen to their former names contrasted with their new names. Daniel means God is my judge. His new name, Belteshazzar. O lady, wife of the god Bel, protect the king. That's pretty charming. Next, Hananiah means Yahweh is gracious. Shadrach, command of Aku, who is the moon god. Mishael, who is what God is, versus Meshach, who is like Aku. Azariah, Yahweh is my helper, versus Abednego, servant of Nebo, or the shining one. This is a pretty clear attempt to take something of who these guys were and change it. Their names formerly praising Yahweh changed to names focusing on 3 of the Babylonian gods. So clearly the Babylonians were intent on shaping them into something new, taking away their old customs and beliefs, and replacing them with a Babylonian identity. As far as conquering people goes, it's actually a pretty smart assimilation tactic. And it seems like it actually worked to a certain extent. The captives did grow in their knowledge of Babylonian culture and practice, and Daniel and his friends didn't seem to fight the name change. If you continue reading in the book of Daniel, you'll see his three friends after chapter 1 are basically solely referred to as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego instead of Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael, which is sad because they're much uglier names, but it's the way that it is. Daniel, though, slightly different. And this is, I think, one of the first clues that some resistance is happening. Daniel is the author of this book, and so this is all from his perspective. And he does refer to himself as Belteshazzar later in the book, but particularly when he's being referred to or spoken to by an official of the king's court. So clearly the Babylonians called him Belteshazzar. But it is interesting, throughout the book of Daniel, especially when he is talking about his inner thoughts or his worship, generally he uses Daniel instead, which seems to point to him not giving up on his former identity. He never gave up on seeing himself as one of God's people, even when he was in exile. So, contest number 2, cultural identity. You can kind of probably give the Babylonians another victory here. They, after all, were the victors in the conflict, the military conflict, and so they could kind of force the captives to do whatever they want. But already you start to see a rebellion in Daniel, and we question whether or not the Babylonians really succeeded in changing who Daniel and his friends were. And perhaps the next 2 contests will give us a better view into their motivations. So, contest number 3. Food. It doesn't appear that Daniel chose for every single issue to be a hill to die on. He did, after all, assimilate into the Babylonian culture in some ways. But verses 8 to 16 show how Daniel and his friends refused to be forced completely into a new identity as the third contest unfolds in the issue of the king's food. So we have Ashpenaz, who was over all the captives, and he was the steward in charge of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He tried to convince them to eat the king's food like all the other captives were doing, but Daniel had other ideas. Feeling a deep desire not to defile himself with the king's food, he respectfully pleaded for an exemption. And I think the way that he went about doing this is really interesting. He wasn't demanding or really pushy or obnoxious in the way that he made this request. He was still respectful, but he did try to go at this issue in a way that would not defile himself. This was an important thing to him. Surprisingly, he and his friends were allowed to do this. After some convincing, the steward allowed them to try a 10-day test of their a new diet, vegetables and water instead of the king's food. It's not entirely clear why Daniel thought this food would defile him. Some people think the king's food would have included unclean, ritually impure meats that the Jewish people were not allowed to eat under the law. Others think that the food and the wine would have been offered to idols and therefore would have been unfit for them to consume, although it's possible that the vegetables that they were given instead were also offered to idols, so that might have been one that was sort of difficult for them to avoid. Still, others claim that it was mostly an attempt to distance themselves from the Babylonian king and his religion. I think all of these approaches have some merit. We don't know 100%. There's no conclusive proof that one of these is the sole reason for their resistance. But I don't think this is the main issue here anyway. The true importance of this is that Daniel, for some reason or other, recognized the defiling nature of the king's food, and he responded by seeking an alternative. He would not defile himself. This not only demonstrates his desire to do right and to stand firm in his convictions, but it also provided God with an opportunity to turn the tide in this third contest. God did some things here, some miraculous things. What happens after this 10-day test of their diet? Well, some things happen that, scientifically speaking, shouldn't really have mattered that much. 10 days, it's a 10-day test. I mean, unless you're starving yourself or gluttonizing yourself, probably not that much is going to change within such a short period of time. I don't know what y'all's experience with diet has been, but generally it's a gradual process. But after 10 days, what happens? They look healthier than everyone else, significantly, enough so that the steward says, there's a clear difference here. God intervenes, granting them a desirable outcome. I might even go so far as to say a miraculous outcome. And I think that it was miraculous in a sense that this steward even allowed them to make this test in the first place. He had no reason to. He actually mentioned that he was risking his head by doing so. God granted them favor in his sight. So at last, in this third contest over food, God's people enjoy a clear victory. When their desires aligned with God's, he enabled them to gain the upper hand in this contest of cultures, and their wishes are granted. Not only are they prospering physically compared to everyone else in their social circle, but they also gain favor in the sight of influential people. Contest number 3, God's people prevail. Contest number 4. The last of these 4 contests, which is laid out in verses 17 to 21, is the culmination of all these months of training and re-education as the youths chosen for the program go before King Nebuchadnezzar himself to be judged. How will they fare against the rest of the men of the kingdom? So we could call this fourth contest something like before the king. We don't know very much about what happened in those intervening months, that time of testing and training, but we certainly know the results. Yet again, God honors his faithful servants by granting them wisdom, learning, and skill. And he even gives Daniel the further gift of interpretation of dreams, which plays a very important role in his future in Babylon. So when these 4 come before the king and are examined, it becomes clear that God's people have far outdistanced in every area those set on pleasing the king. Not only do they perform better in their tests than the other youths, but they even appear wiser than the king's own advisors and magicians, the people that he would use to help him govern. In this way, God's people triumph over those who have conquered them, and God sets them up for lives of faithful service that will have a resounding impact on their own nation and the nation of Gentiles that they are occupying. So, contest number 4, clear victory for God's people. God was able to use Daniel and his friends because of their posture, their attitude, the way that they were seeking to keep themselves clean and pure, the way that they were faithful to God. So, what about us? Are we clearly living lives of faithful service? Are our witnesses having a resounding impact on God's people? Are they impacting the nations around us? In Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, we have clear examples of people of God in exile, grappling with difficult questions of faithfulness and emerging victorious. So while we may not be living in a country that has been conquered by another nation, we certainly find ourselves in an exile that bears some striking similarities with the exile that God's people were in in the book of Daniel. We, like they were, are God's people in a foreign land, immersed in a culture that wants to change our identity, wants to assimilate us, wants us to capitulate to its culture and its re-education program. So how can we, like Daniel and company, keep from defiling ourselves in the midst of all this pressure? How can we tell which hills to die on and which areas are perhaps of lesser importance? Now, these are complex questions, and as such, there are no simple answers, but I suggest that in examining Daniel's tactics, we can find some strategies that we can learn from. 3 things in particular stick out as ways to rebel against a culture of defilement. First, know what you believe. Second, act on what you believe. And third, find people who will strengthen your belief. Again, those are know what you believe, act on what you believe, and find people who will strengthen your belief. So, first up, know what you believe. Sounds easy, right? If only. Today's delight in cultural relativism has muddied the world's perception of evil, and culturally accepted norms have become increasingly fraught with dangers. That doesn't mean that everything about our culture is evil, but it does mean that we have to work even harder than ever to be perceptive. We can't rely on the culture around us to show us where the lines are, because increasingly they don't have any lines. So we have to know what we believe so we don't unsuspectingly get swept off in the flow of modern ideology. And I don't just mean that we need to know our catechism or we need to know the fundamental doctrines of the faith, though those are obviously important, very important, but we need to examine our position on specific issues as well. For instance, what do we believe about our finances? Is our use of money defiling us, or are we confident that we're using it in ways that reflect and honor God, that reflect honor on God? What do we believe about our media consumption? Are the things we are watching and listening to defiling us, or do they honor God? What about our clothing? Does the clothing we wear defile us, or does it honor God? What about our participation in events or holidays? Do the events we participate in or how we celebrate holidays defile us, or do they honor God? And the list goes on and on and on. I didn't pick those out because I thought they were of so much greater importance than all the other issues. Those are just examples. There are so many things in our life that we have to think about intentionally. We have to know our stance. We have to know what we believe. Fact is, being one of God's people means striving to honor God in every area of our lives, no matter how that affects our relationship with our surrounding culture. That's why we have to know what we believe, so we can recognize when a cultural value violates that belief. And then we can draw a line that we won't cross, in the same way that Daniel drew a line when he refused to eat the king's food. Now, this doesn't mean that we have to withdraw completely from society like a hermit. That can be tempting. If society is dangerous, the easiest way to avoid the temptations is to just get out of it. But that's not what Daniel does. Daniel was incredibly involved in the society he found himself in, despite its foreign nature. What this does mean, though, is that we need to actually think things through. We need to be intentional. We need to go beyond blind acceptance or blind rejection and seek out actual truth. We need to know what we believe. Do we swallow new trends blindly without examining whether they are healthy or not? That's not being intentional. It's being reckless and naive. Do we uphold old trends blindly without examining if they're still effective or not? That's equally unwise. It perpetuates a damaging system for as long as we doggedly hold to it. It is both important that we draw lines and that we know why we drew them and where we drew them. We need to know what we believe. Now, not everyone will always make boundaries in the same place. And this is difficult because it's easy to believe that once we have found a way that works for us, and we will remain faithful to that, then everyone else must also maintain the exact same line that we have chosen because we have found the way. But maybe it matters more that people are recognizing that a line should be drawn than that they're picking the exact same line that we are. Daniel's line, after all, was over the consumption of unclean food, which has become a lesser issue since Jesus' statement that it's what comes out of a person, not what he takes in, that defiles him. But Daniel's commitment to identify with God rather than the Babylonian culture is just as important in our context as it was then. I see in Daniel a man who examined the culture that he was being immersed in, and he picked his hills to die on. He didn't die on every hill, but he certainly had some things that he was completely unwilling to budge on. Know what you believe. The next tactic may seem incredibly obvious, but once we know what we believe, we have to act on it. Convictions must come with commitment. Though it seems so simple, it can be surprisingly hard to do. I might know that I am spending too much time on social media, but it can be a lot harder to actually cut back on time spent. What kind of commitment am I willing to make to address the issue? How will I make sure that I actually stick to that commitment once I've made it? Do I need to set a time limit? Do I need to get an accountability partner to check up on me? Do I need to entirely cut it from my diet, at least for a time? And again, I use social media as an example. So many things that the same type of reasoning should be applied to. Know in which areas you feel comfortable assimilating into the culture, like Daniel accepted his Babylonian education, and know which areas you feel called to rebel against culture. And once you have found where you need to rebel, do so respectfully, as Daniel did to the steward over him, but do it courageously as well. Lastly, find people who strengthen your belief. In this story, Daniel was fortunate to have 3 good friends who joined him in his commitments to keep from defiling himself. This provided him with support, with motivation, with accountability, and we can have access to these same things, these same benefits. This is why we participate in a local body of believers. We're here to bounce ideas off each other, to discuss major issues and even sometimes minor issues, to encourage each other to love God more than we love the culture we find ourselves exiled in, to resolve with each other to abstain from what is evil, and to grow and learn together. God's church is an incredible gift to mankind for our continual upbuilding, encouragement, and instruction. Let's do our best to contribute positively, to learn from each other, and to respect one another as we join together in rebelling against what we discern to be wrong in the world. Recognizing that, just like Daniel and his friends, we're just sojourners here. Instead of tearing each other down, let's work together towards common goals of faithfulness and love towards God. So now, back to the song I started butchering from earlier. Dare to be a Daniel? Yes, absolutely. But don't feel the need to stand alone. You have a God who loves you and wants to uphold you like he did Daniel. And you have a body of believers you can join with to subtly rebel against pervasive evil in your context of exile. You don't even necessarily have to charge across the world, toppling giants and conquering the world for Christ. Often, God calls us first to a quiet acceptance of his will and a rejection of what defiles us. So how does this story end? After these 4 contests, who wins ultimately? I think verse 21 tells us a little bit about that. It reminds us that Daniel was still there until the first year of King Cyrus. And we know the story of Daniel. We know that he outlasted Nebuchadnezzar. He outlasted Belshazzar. He outlasted all the kings of Babylon. Babylon was a short-lived empire. It toppled pretty quickly. But Daniel, in his faithfulness, outlasted, was able to serve faithfully throughout all of those kings, even into the reign of the next empire. God took one faithful servant in Daniel and used him mightily to influence the kingdom for good all throughout his life. And God has granted his church a similar longevity. Until Christ returns and we escape from exile, a remnant will remain, rebelling against the world and staying faithful unto God. We don't need military victories or the gain of great power to succeed. We need only stay true to what we know is right. We need to know what we believe. We need to act on what we believe. And we need to find people who will strengthen our belief. Be people of God in exile, and God can and will use you effectively. Thank you.